Hi, I'm Sarah Hodges, and you're listening to Executives Uncut, the podcast where we provide solutions for the corporate cycle of hell. This is episode 2 of the show, and today we're talking about binary thinking. I'm here again with Fergus Connolly, performance coach, author, and TED Talk speaker, as part of our Concepts of Chaos series. Fergus, welcome again.
Sarah, so nice to meet you.
Maybe
What are we
we
what
meet. We have a fresh
what
start every day.
what are we talking about today?
Binary thinking. Will you tell a story about it to orient our viewers a little bit more with what it is exactly?
Yeah, so I really first became aware of the downsides to binary thinking, actually looking at analysis in sports games. So with elite players, coaches like collect statistics, and things are either a tackle, they're either something that's black or white. But one day I was sitting with a coach one day, and he brought up this phrase, how he coaches in the gray. I didn't quite understand what he meant, but he showed me examples of, when somebody, for example, makes a tackle or makes a pass, and it may not be successful, but the overall outcome was positive. And what he was showing me was the dangers of just viewing and analyzing things in a black or white manner. And he used it in a really, really good way to help explain to players and other coaches how to continue to improve. That nothing was ever entirely just black or white, right or wrong, that it was coaching in the gray was the phrase that he used. And it really made me change how I looked at athletes, looked at people, and helped direct them and help look at the bigger picture, the bigger outcome. And the phrase that we started to use was, you don't want to be in a case where the operation was a success, but the patient died. In other words, you don't want to get something
Oh
right
yeah.
at the sake of the bigger, the bigger problem.
Can you repeat that last part again?
You don't want to get short-term success and to be very black and white uh, for the sake of the bigger issue that you're trying to solve.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. We had a little bit of a technical glitch there, maybe just on my end. So I wanted to make sure that our audience heard that. Yeah, absolutely. It's about the ultimate outcome, really, at the end of the day, and labeling things as good or bad can really limit us. So in coaching, I define binary thinking. It's viewpoints we take that are really extreme or polarized, and we often do that to stay inside of our comfort zone, right? It makes us comfortable to label something as this or that because we can understand our surroundings. And I think in coaching executives, where I most commonly see this is storytelling. When an executive maybe has a sort of conflict with another coworker, and they tell themselves a story about, well they're just this and they think that, and usually there's this strong kind of victim villain story that is happening with that executive. And that's actually a time when I use binary thinking as a tool to help them find the gray, to coach in the gray, where I say, well, what's another completely extreme example on the flip side, where instead of being a villain, that person's kind of a hero. And often they realize that there's other perspectives, right? There's other potential stories that could exist here. And they are able to find it in the gray. It's like a pendulum, right? If you swing the pendulum super hard to the other direction, eventually it'll find its center. Um, so, I think that you've mentioned this before, right? I think you called it red teaming to find the gray. That was a term I wasn't as familiar with. Can you talk a little bit about red teaming and how executives can use that?
Yeah, and just going back to this, the villain victim idea. Like, I mean, that's what, from a young age we're taught. That people are either bad, good or evil. Like back to Disney movies and everything. But obviously the
Right.
world's not that way. So it's like, I mean, we're taught to think of good and bad, and it helps us explain things, but it doesn't give the complete picture. And
Mm.
one of the things that's used quite a bit in the military, where I first came across, was this idea of red teaming, where occasionally for example, if you're building a product or you're building a process or a system, you may want to look at it from the enemy's perspective. And so you create what's known as a red team within your group, and their job is to take the opposite side. But you can even do it in meetings as well, for example, where you want somebody, to constantly challenge, to take an extreme position and challenge you. And it's a wonderful way to find holds, to prevent biases that we as a group, to prevent groupthink. And red team can be used, it's a really valuable way to look at if you're trying to create a robust structure or process, to have, a group of people or a person to challenge it, to find the weaknesses and limitations.
Absolutely. And, I think that it's important to acknowledge, though, that that process can be extremely uncomfortable, especially if you are, without realizing it, engaging in binary thinking to protect yourself emotionally, right? Or to stay within your comfort zone. So, when you're talking about within your group, I think it's really important, don't you, to have someone really safe who you can discuss this with, whether it's a mentor or a coach or consultant or whomever you choose, maybe even your partner, but to be able to, really feel safe enough to explore this. What do you think? Do you think that there's a lot of emotions involved when you try to move away from binary thinking?
We use binary thinking often as a protective mechanism because we can take up a position. Obviously, we're always the good guy and, or the good person. So we feel safe. But like I said, the world's not like that. People are more complex. And so stepping out of that, yeah, it's scary. But within your organization, within your group, or as a leader, if you can create that safe space with trust, there are huge benefits to challenging people and to exploring the gray together, because that's where you make the most progress. Progress isn't going to be made in taking up extreme perspectives. So yeah, it can be scary, but when you get across that Rubicon, like that's really exciting, and that's what teamwork's about. Like even in relationships, when you you explore the differences and you come to an agreement, you understand where the other person is. That's where that draws people closer together.
Yeah, well, it's the same thing for professional relationships on a team, right? Whether you are a leader or, a manager or part of the team itself, it's still a relationship. So I love that you mentioned that. So, speaking of the excitement of being able to explore these ideas, what do you think are some of the benefits of gray area thinking?
Well, the thing that I've always been most excited about, coaching in the gray or thinking in the gray, is just the opportunity for innovation. So I have this phrase that progress is made where paradigms meet. So when people have different perspectives or different areas or different opinions, the real progress is made in the middle where they meet. So, having those different groups, different perspectives, or like that's where you start to see things from a different vantage point, from a different viewpoint, and that's where you can make most progress. It's just getting there that's the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that because gray area thinking does in and of itself inherently create a sense of social safety. From a neuroscience perspective, right? It
Mm-hmm.
also helps your team access higher brain function, and they are more creative, they're more focused, engaged. There's a community of respect, right, for other ideas and perspectives, and that's where solutions are found. I often find that when I'm coaching an executive through a dilemma, that they're stuck there because of the black and white thinking. They're only looking at extreme, um, from extreme viewpoints. And sometimes the question I ask too that can be helpful is, how can both extremes be true? And that kind of forces them, right, to narrow in to what you were saying, where the different kind of paradigms meet, and say, okay, and usually they come out with some sort of moderate solution that is much easier to execute.
Yeah, like going back to the idea of red teaming, sometimes I've used role play where you put the other person in the person who they feel threatened or challenged. If I put them in that position, so they get to almost play or see the other person's perspective, and all of a sudden then it becomes a little bit different, because that's, you want to get people into the gray area so that they can explore and move forward. Like, nobody is going to make progress when you just take up extreme positions with that binary thinking. And the term binary and binary thinking, largely came from coding, where things are either, 1 or a 0. But like we say, in the real world, things are never quite that simple.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious on the field, right? Like with sports, how did the players improve as a result of coaching in the gray?
The single biggest benefit were that the players understood the global objective, the company or the team goal, which was to win a game. So rather than them focusing on individual statistics like the number of tackles made or number of passes or whatever it was, they performed actions with the greater objective in mind, the success of the team. So what it did was it drew people together as a team more rather than focusing on themselves. And also what it meant was that rather than them trying to accumulate individual statistics, they were doing things now for the benefit of the team as a whole. That's the biggest benefit of thinking in the gray, coaching in the gray.
That makes a lot of sense. And I can see how that would be, really applicable to a corporation, right? If everybody really understands why and how their part plays in the overall picture, it's easier to feel like you're part of a team, and to feel like what you're doing, even if it's like one email, has purpose for overall success for the company.
Yeah, because things become more collaborative, because you're understanding, where everybody else is coming from. You understand that there's a common goal, vision. So that's true, teamwork. And I'm not going to sacrifice the group outcome just for myself to get another statistic, or, like I say, another check mark. It's what's the best outcome for the team. So what do I have to do? And sometimes that means sharing responsibility, or it means, pushing someone else forward. But again, that's from a management perspective. That's the beauty, that's the art of management. And one other thing actually that you touched on earlier, even from a coaching perspective. So when you're coaching someone, and you've seen this many times, you don't have the answers yourself. So you find a solution with your client. You help coach them to find the solution together. It's never, and that's an example of collaboration again, where it's not one person doesn't have the answer, the other person does, and it's a transaction. It's really a transformational process of helping people find solutions. But just back to sport, the real benefit overall are that your players become better decision makers, in the context, in the moment.
Yeah, so I call that almost self-leadership too, right? Like they're
Exactly.
able to, yeah, which is really, really cool. And that's what I always say, is that the best leaders, don't just lead followers. They lead leaders, right? Like they turn all of their followers into self-leaders who really own their projects, own what it is that they want to do, how they want to play a role in that organization, or with whatever objective that organization has. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about tips, right, for leaders to help their teams integrate gray area thinking. Because as hard as it is for the leader or the executive to think in the gray, it's just as hard for their employees. So, what are some strategies and tips that they can use to coach their employees?
Well, the first one for me is always listening, and listening carefully. I always say that rule 1 is listening, and rule 2 is see rule 1. And really understanding the other person's perspective, truly hearing what they're saying. So not interrupting them, not rushing to come up with a solution, like, and exploring it. And sometimes even, when somebody states their perspective or their viewpoint, even though you disagree, it might simply be something like, okay, tell me a little bit more about that so I understand it better. And so now they get to express themselves further. They've been heard. You understand exactly what the source is. And that allows you then to take time to think, okay, how can we find a compromise, or how can I, explain my solution to them in the best way? That's always the starting point for me, is truly listening.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think after listening, one of my biggest tips, and you'll hear me say this again and again and again for executives, is asking open-ended questions. My intern, Justin, on here, he hears me ask him open-ended questions a zillion times every single meeting, because that allows him to think through the process, as opposed to me just telling him like, hey, Justin, do A, B, and C. It's, hey, Justin, here's the process that we've been doing. How would you improve upon it? I think that the part of binary thinking is letting go of attachments to expectations and outcomes, and accepting and getting excited about the fact that the people who work for you and with you might have better ideas than you do, right? And like, or better versions of your idea, and how to integrate all of them together so that everyone starts to rise.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that we do unconsciously is that we, as leaders, very often, uh, we and we don't notice ourselves doing this, but for example, we bring an agenda or a document, and it's almost viewed as ours. And I noticed a number of years ago that this became kind of a habit. Like, I would have a document, and it had principles or protocols or procedures. And I moved away very quickly from doing that to using a screen, and this is our document, so people can collaborate and change on it. Because sometimes when you present something, people think, oh, that's yours. So really what I was trying to do is to encourage, this is our document, and we can all play with it, challenge it, tweak it. So, and not to become too self-conscious, or to feel too prideful about something that's ours. It's not ours. It's the company's. It's our groups. We're producing this together. This is teamwork. And so what's going to form in the middle is going to be the outcome or the delivery from gray work, so to speak.
Yeah. And I think it's also being about open to the fact that the end result might look different from what you envisioned, but that doesn't mean that it's worse, right? It's either it
Yeah.
could very well be equal or better.
Yeah. And I also, I do challenge people from time to time to think, look, sometimes the solution that the group is going to produce, you may think it's not as good as what you had, initially, but if you have everybody bought into it, that's better than having the perfect plan that nobody is committed to. So it's a trade-off. I always say that the first two things of leadership are service and sacrifice. Like, you're obviously there to serve everybody else, but also you have to sacrifice something to get everybody on board. Otherwise, you just have a dictatorship, and that's not teamwork. So it's allowing people to contribute, to tweak it, to break what you have, and to come to a solution together as a group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and something you mentioned earlier about conveying the overall objective. Sometimes when I'm coaching leaders who are in manufacturing, they find it very difficult because, like, they're running factories essentially, and the employees have to just do their job, and they have to do the job exactly the way that they're supposed to do the job, and there's not very much thinking involved, and sometimes that can really wear on the employees over time, right? It can be really boring. But there's a
Mm-hmm.
really big difference, right? Between like, hey, make this coil, and the guy just makes the coil, or like, hey, make this coil because this is the mechanism on a child's bike that, on the training wheels that prevents them from tipping over. So when these children are riding down the road, the coil that you're making is actually keeping them safe until they're ready to ride on two wheels. Like, that's cool, right? Then they're part of an overall purpose. What they're doing matters. And I think that as executives, it's really important to convey the why, and just like you were saying earlier, and focus on everybody working toward the why, and that alone will help ward against binary thinking.
Yeah, and that also is actually more and more important now with current generations coming through. You'll find that, millennials and generation, whatever one we're on now, people are far
Z.
more they've got but they've got a far greater, more positive awareness of other issues, social issues, whatever. And so that's something that, as employers or leaders, you need to be aware of, that, explaining that, sharing that in terms of what you and your company are enthusiastic about, that helps their commitment to, to your company and to the overall objectives. And I think, in some of the other episodes, we should probably explore that idea of, what the actual vision, and there's a term they use in the military known as commander's intent, like what is the overall objective, so that it doesn't remove your own innovative thinking.
That's a great point, and I think a great point to end on. It's a good takeaway for our executives.
Yeah, and it underlines the importance of being aware of binary thinking and the pitfalls, that we can unconsciously fall into if we're not aware of just taking up those extreme positions and not coaching in the gray.
Yeah. So, coaching challenge for all of you executives out there who are listening. This week, pay attention to where you are engaging in binary thinking, where your thinking is too extreme in one way or the other, and really try to convey the ultimate why of your organization to your employees. Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Executives Uncut. And if you enjoyed the content, please make sure to subscribe and share with someone who could benefit from this talk. Visit hodgescoaching.com for new episodes, or follow us at Hodges Coaching on social media. And you can find Fergus at fergusconnolly.com, right, Fergus?
Yes.
Awesome. All right. I'm Sarah Hodges. This was Fergus Connolly, and we will see you next week.